Well, welcome all. Welcome to the Pacific Zen Luminaries series. We have with us Jane Hirshfield, who is a longtime friend of Pacific Zen and just an outstanding poet. And I feel so blessed that she agreed to join us here tonight and to read some of her translations and some of her poems and tell us some of her stories and share her life with us, really. So I thought what we would do, we have some more people coming in, we could maybe meditate for a few minutes and then we would begin. So let's do that. In the process of writing a poem, poems appear as often as not to arise looking outward. The writer turns toward the kingfishers and the falcons, hears the bells of churches and the sheep. Poems appear as often as not to arise in looking outward. The writer turns toward kingfishers and falcons. Hears the bells of churches and the sheep. Jane, welcome. Welcome. I'd like to open up with a reading of Basho that we're a little familiar with here at Pacific Zen. And this was your translation along with your collaborator, Mariko, I think. The moon and sun are travelers of 100 generations. The years coming and going are wanderers too, spending a lifetime adrift on boat decks, greeting old age while holding a horse by the mouth. For such a person, each day is a journey, and the journey itself becomes home. I kind of feel, Jane, in spending a lot of time with your poetry and your writings and the like over the last month, I feel like the journey, each poem is a journey for you. And the journey itself, the poem itself is home. So I'd love to hear for us more of your journey. When did you get started in both poetry and in Zen?
Well, they both began earlier than I would have thought. I did not remember this until my mother pulled out a piece of paper when my first book was published. But I was taught to write, in first, second grade by my public school teacher, Mrs. Barlow. And as soon as I learned how to write, there is one of those large brown sheets of paper with the blue lines on them. And on it, it says, "I want to be a writer when I grow up," which I would not have recalled, except I was shown this when I was 29. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. And quite unusual that my mother kept it also. But then at the same time, the first book that I bought with my own allowance money when I was 7 or 8 years old from a stationery store on First Avenue on the Lower East Side of New York was a book of Japanese haiku. And so somehow, from the very beginning, before I was formed, before I knew anything, I was drawn to these two things. I was drawn to haiku that I have no idea now what I understood the meaning was, but that were, steeped in the worldview of Buddhism and of Zen. And I was drawn to writing, and it was always for me from childhood poetry, because I don't have a very narrative mind. I'm not good at making up stories or plots. So I never wrote short stories when I was a child. I only wrote poems. And, throughout my years as a young person, much of whose life took place in books and in reading, in retrospect, I was able to see later, everything I was drawn to was leading me towards Buddhist practice. Because, things that you might think are Western, as we all know from R.H. Blythe's Zen in English Literature book, have Buddhist ideas in them, whether or not they came from any knowledge of Buddhism. But for example, when I read the New England Transcendentalists in high school, I was completely drawn to them. Well, and it turns out that Thoreau and Emerson had been reading Buddhist sutras translated into French, that they had in turn been influenced by. I was very drawn, I took Latin for 5 years. I was very drawn to the Roman poets, Horace and Catullus. And, they are the poets of Stoic and Epicurean philosophy, which includes carpe diem, seize the day, live in this moment. And so, it just seemed that all the way along the line, whatever I loved had some Buddhist possibility, some gate into Buddhist thinking and worldview in it. Then when I went to college, I designed an independent major rather than be an English major, because with the hubris of the very young, I thought I knew how to read books in English, but I could use some help reading books in languages I didn't know. And I took a great many courses in East Asian Studies department. So I was reading Chinese classical poetry and Japanese classical poetry and no plays. And all of these, again, were steeped in Buddhism. And so, unlike, most people of my generation came to be interested in practicing themselves because they heard Alan Watts on the radio. I never heard Alan Watts on the radio. I read Chinese and Japanese poems. My second year, I think, Gary Snyder came to campus and gave a talk on the Yamabushi mountain monk practice. And he was the first practicing American I'd ever seen. And I looked at this man with his ponytail and his earring and the glimmer in his eye and his passionate introduction to wilderness and Buddhist practice. And that also resonated because, of course, anyone who grows up on the Lower East Side of Manhattan longs for wilderness, or at least I did. And so that was what created my interest. And then, my last year in New Jersey, after graduating, I took, my excellent degree and did what anybody did in the early 70s, which was a year of farm labor. And one of my friends had an early copy of the Tassajara bread book, which had the monastic schedule on the inside back cover in those days. And that was how I knew there was a Zen monastery in America. And so when I got in my red Dodge van with tie-dyed curtains and set off to look for my future, living in the van, crossing the country, when I got to California, I thought,
was it a VW van?
No, but everybody turns it into one. It was a Dodge Sportsman with windows, but no, everybody, I say Dodge Sportsman and people hear VW bus. It's quite amazing. And so, I was living in it. I was camping out, and I had invented a Zazen practice for myself while I was in college that I was doing in rudimentary form. I had one brief introduction to how to sit earlier on. And somehow I'd remembered that and came back to it. And when I got to California, I thought, I'll go look at that monastery. And because it was summer, and because I semi-invented without knowing what it was, Tongariro, and refused to leave when I was told at the gatehouse to the 14-mile mountain dirt road that I needed to go to the city center for a week first and then come back. And quite unlike me, I didn't leave. I just kept hanging around. And Lou Hartman, husband of one of the former abbots, Blanche Hartman, he knew what I was doing, even though I didn't know what I was doing. And he relented and said, all right, spend the night here in Jamesburg with my daughter and me. We'll sit zazen in the morning and I'll send you in and you can be a guest student at Tassajara. And I thought I'd stay for a few months until I knew all about what this Buddhism business was. And of course, after a few months of practice, I did, of course, go to the city center in Green Gulch. You can't just go to monastery straight off. After a few months, I understood that I knew nothing about what this Buddhism business was all about, and that I was going to be staying for quite a lot longer. And so I did.
That's great. That's a great story. I want to do a few Japanese tanka, if that's okay, and get in that. For a couple of reasons. One is in reading the Ink Dark Moon, the poems really spoke to me. They're just poems of passion and of life and of regret and of sadness and loneliness and ultimately of death of these two women. And I love the book. And I went to a memorial service back in Maine a weekend ago. And I was coming back from Boston and getting off the airplane. And I was putting your books into my backpack because I had them out and I was reading them. And a young man, he was in his 20s, he said, Ink Dark Moon. He says, I love that book, Jane Hirshfield. And I started to laugh and I said, I love it too. And she's really, really great. She's going to be speaking. So I hope he joined us here tonight. But let's look at a few of those poems. I don't want to take too much time, but they're just so alive and so lush.
Yeah. So I'll just say, when I was at those East Asian Studies seminar table in 1971 or 2, whichever it was, there were only 6 of these poems had been translated into English. There was this very tiny sampling of the women's tanka in English. And then there were no plays about the earlier of the 2 poets, Ono no Kamachi. And at that time, I thought, there needs to be more. There should be a book of this. It's obvious that these are great poets and they should be in English. And I waited 15 years for somebody else to translate it, and they didn't. And so, 15 years later, by chance and circumstance or karma, I was able to do it because I was introduced to my co-translator, Mariko Aratani. We were both absolute amateurs, but I by then had done 8 years of formal training in Zen, and 3 of them living in the monastery, very close to the lives these women had led. And Mariko was a native-speaking Japanese woman who loved the poems also and had come to America when she was 27. And so between us, we made one whole for working with these poems. But I was drawn to them, for exactly what you said. I recognized in them my own experience as a young woman, falling in love, having my heart broken, falling in love again. But also, these poems were what helped bring me to Buddhism, because they do have a Buddhist underpinning. They are not only love poems, they are also recognizably poems by women, both of whom practiced the Buddhism of their time. And then also, you can't help but, if you pay attention, so what used to be, before it got supplanted by something else, the most quoted thing I said for a long time was something I said that just sort of got repeated and got around, that all Buddhism can be held in 7 words. Everything changes, everything is connected, pay attention. And, there's lots of things that aren't named in there, but if you recognize that everything is connected, you will recognize compassion, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And if you pay attention to the course of love, everything changes, and transience absolutely underlies these poems, as well as a couple of them which do have explicit Buddhist meanings. So Ono no Kamachi, 9th century poet, stands in Japanese literature kind of in the place that Sappho stands in the West. When my desire grows too fierce, I wear my bedclothes inside out, dark as the night's rough husk. If this were, so that's one poem. There are 5 lines in English, 31 syllables in Japanese. If this were a dream, I would surely see you again. Why must waking love be left incomplete? And then this one, I think, is a really good example. And forgive me, John, John chose most of these poems, and then I suggested a couple of others, and this is one I'm adding to the ones he picked. Is this love reality or a dream? I cannot know when both reality and dreams exist without truly existing. And that is a Dharma poem.
Yeah.
That is a poem about the unfixedness of, what we think is real, what we think is interior.
Which are themes in your poetry. You talk a lot about not knowing or uncertainty. You talk a lot about vulnerability, and permeability, right?
Yes.
So, yeah.
So I do think, and we can return to that later, but I do think that the humility of don't know mind is indispensable to good poetry, any kind. Arrogance and poetry don't go well together. Adamance and poetry don't go well together. She said adamantly. So I'll give you now some by the second poet in the book, Izumi Shikibu. Her place in Japanese literature is closer to that of Emily Dickinson in American literature. She is, the great woman poet of the tradition.
And she was married twice. She had 2 lovers. She came from a wealthy family and was outcast by them. It just...
Oh, no, she wasn't outcast.
Oh, she wasn't. Okay.
No.
I thought she was kicked out. Yeah.
These women were, both of them. So, Heian era Japan was the most proto-feminist era in world history before the 20th century came along. Women had now we are talking about aristocratic women, the women of the court class. And there's a whole anthropology behind that, which is covered in the introduction to the book, if anybody's curious. But they were educated, they had status, they could decide who they wanted to marry, they could take lovers, they could discard lovers. And they were, in their own time, famous as writers. Women in the arts had equal standing to men. You don't find that anywhere in the world in 1,000 years ago. So yes, but Shikibu, we know more of the facts of Shikibu's life because she was a couple hundred years later, and so more information survived. This is an early one. Lying alone, my black hair tangled, uncombed, I long for the one who touched it first. In this world, love has no color. Yet how deeply my body is stained by yours. That was a translation problem because I meant it to be heard as the staining of stained glass windows and not the other possibility. But the only other word I could have used that would be equal to the Japanese in meaning would have been dyed And that too has another connotation. So I just went for the stained glass windows. This next one has an interesting dharma. So I'll talk a little bit about this next one. It has a head note written by the poet in the autumn on retreat at a mountain temple. And so Shikibu did go to Buddhist temples to practice during her life. And what she wrote was, although I try to hold the single thought of Buddha's teaching in my heart, I cannot help but hear the many crickets' voices calling as well.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, if you've immersed yourself in her life and her poems, you understand those crickets are both the actual crickets and also her lovers down at the foot of the mountain back in Heian-kyo, present-day Kyoto. And at first reading, you think, it's a poem about being distracted during meditation or service, perhaps. But then when I thought about it a little more deeply, I went, no, this is a poem about very good practice. Because as we, Zen practice is not about walling yourself off. It's not about shutting your ears. It's not about going into a state of closed trance. That's other forms of meditation. And so, in fact, at Tassajara, when the birds would begin singing during early morning zazen, as the light came up over the course of the 3 periods of meditation before breakfast, hearing those birds was your meditation. And similarly, not walling yourself off from your emotional life is your meditation.
Yeah, the Buddha's teachings, right?
Exactly.
Yeah,
and then this other poem of hers, which is in a different way, absolutely, unquestionably a Dharma poem. I cannot say which is which. The glowing plum blossom is the spring night's moon.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
a poem about, so the moon in Japanese poetry is often a figure for enlightenment or awakening.
Yeah.
And the plum blossom is a figure for transience. And there is no separation between the luminous opening.
That's
of
nice.
Both of them. Yeah.
Plum blossom.
Yeah. And the last poem of hers I'll read is one that changed my life in translating it. So it's a very important poem for me. When Mariko gave me the literal Japanese and the Japanese word order, I knew there was a really good poem in there, but I had a lot of trouble understanding it. And it took me a week of working with it until the penny dropped and I understood it, and then I could translate it, and then it changed my life. So the poem is, although the wind blows terribly here, the moonlight also leaks between the roof planks of this ruined house.
Yeah.
And what
it's a beautiful image
from that, absolutely gorgeous. And all the things you've already mentioned about permeability and vulnerability. What I learned from this poem, or what maybe I knew before and recognized it in the poem in a transforming way, was that if you try to keep a way out of your life, if you try to exclude suffering, difficulty, desire, all of the disruptive emotions, you might be able to do that. But if you did, the walls of your house would be so tightly closed that you would also be excluding the moonlight, any possibility of awakening, any possibility of a fully human life. And so for me, this became a poem of, an abiding theme in my own work that I can trace from book to book to book are these poems about allowing the difficult in. Because of course, that's not a problem you can solve. Every time the difficult knocks on your door, something wants to say, no, go visit my neighbor. I don't need you today, oh difficult. And yet, if we keep our door locked, we won't have our lives.
Yeah. That's lovely. Yeah. Thank you. Can we get to Shikibu's last poem?
Yes. So her final poem The story about it is that it was sent to the Buddhist priest who was her teacher and written on her deathbed. The way I must enter leads from darkness to darkness. O moon above the mountain's rim, please shine a little farther on my path.
That's just so beautiful. Yeah.
So I do recommend their poems to everyone. I think it's an irresistible body of work.
Yeah.
It really is.
Yeah, it is. Thank you so much for that. Let's now move to some of your poetry, perhaps. Huh?
Okay.
You really, you wanted to add cedary fragrance as something. Well, tell us, why did you want to add it?
Yes, so I added that to John's suggested playlist because it is, I think it is both a poem that nothing in its words would tell you this, but it's a poem remembering my years of practice at Tassajara. And it's also a poem which is one of those ones that I think of as in the lineage of Izumi Shikibu's Although the Wind. So a cedary fragrance. Even now, decades after, I wash my face with cold water, not for discipline, nor memory, nor the icy awakening slap, but to practice choosing to make the unwanted wanted. So any of you who have perhaps visited Tassajara or practiced there will know there's no hot water in the cabins. And so in the winter where, most of the time it was not colder than the mid 30s, but every once in a while it would get down to 23 or 24, and you had no heat, you had plastic windows, and you had cold water in your sink. And I just hated it. It was like so uncomfortable and so miserable and so awful. And I was cold all the time. But of course, that is the practice of saying yes to everything, of that icy awakening slap. And I've never washed my face with hot water since at home. In hotels, I let myself do it. It's a treat when I travel. But at home, I still wash my face with cold water every morning. And it makes for a continuous life.
Nice. That's great. Thank you for that. Cold Clear. I love this one because when I look at your poetry, and I look at even just like, for example, Come Thief, randomly. I looked at the contents, and it's a list of the 10,000 things, which when we opened up, you talked about looking out where the writer turns towards the kingfishers and the falcons, and hears the bells of churches and the sheep, and as is the French horn, the first light, the oil, vinegar and oil, etc., etc. And for me, this poem sort of really sprung with that. Yeah.
Thank you. And I thought you'd chosen it because it's one of the only poems in all of my work that actually refers explicitly to having been at Tassajara, because it talks about the wake-up bond, which will be very confusing to, any non-practitioner wouldn't know what I'm talking about.
I did love that line about the Han. Yeah, we can talk about that.
So anyhow, this is a poem. It's in sections, and I'm just going to pause a little bit between the sections. Cold, clear. A person dreams herself blind, hearing the click of a light switch, which of course Tassajara doesn't have. 40 years since the wake-up Han's much battered, ink-written, don't waste time. Night weather's hearable. Sometimes the mallets sound sharp, other times muffled. Self too was hearable inside and outside, the skin, inside and outside the scent of creek and pine. stars, wind, day, night, pine bark. They don't need us. They don't need to be stars, wind, day, night, pine bark.
Hmm. I love that. You know, we had a Suzuki Roshi segment here maybe a year ago. I don't know when it was, but you really got that feel from his recordings of Tassajara, and you know, just exactly what you captured. It's just so beautiful.
Yeah. So it's very odd. I have, as a poet, I chose not to use hardly ever any explicit vocabulary of Dharma.
Mm,
I didn't want to close off people who don't speak those words, have them in their diction. And I didn't want to have some idea about me that would be mostly understood anyhow, standing between my poems and their readers. And so for a long time, you know, when anybody would introduce me as a Buddhist poet, I would say, no, 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 I'm not a Buddhist poet, I'm
yeah.
a human poet. But then every once in a while, something does creep in. And what I liked is in all of those years, people who practiced immediately knew the practice in the poems, whether they made any reference to it or not. They recognized it.
You had a story about W.S. Merwin where, can you just repeat that? That's kind of funny and fun.
So W.S. Merwin and I became friends, and he would call me late in his life. We'd have long phone calls from time to time. And one of the things we would talk about was he did not reveal that he was practicing Buddhism until really close to the end. And nobody ever called him a Buddhist poet. Nobody knew the seriousness of his practice. It just was not part of his public persona. And whenever we'd talk on the phone, you know, the two examples were the great Gary Snyder, who everybody knew he was a Buddhist poet, and W.S. Merwin, who nobody knew he was a Buddhist poet. And they were equally, you know, amazing poets of expression of human life and the Dharma. And I would say to William, I should have done it your way. I should never have let the information out. And he would sort of, you know, nod on the phone. Yeah, could have done that, Jane. Rather than being, you know, betwixt and between the two. Because Gary, you know, Gary, that was always part of his vocabulary, his life, his biography is right out there in the pages. I'm closer to William in that my poems are x-rays of my life, but not narratives of it.
That's great. Well, Amor Fati, could you read that? Let's discuss it after. I don't want to give my thoughts beforehand.
Okay, nice so I will just read it and then we'll talk about it.
Please, please.
I will, though, say for anybody who might not know the phrase, amor fati is the Latin phrase for love of fate. And is, you know, its meaning is basically the embrace of your life, whatever it brings. So again, very continuous with this theme we've been talking about. And its first line, Little Soul, it's the first of a group of 8 poems. 7 of which begin with Little Soul.
Right.
And I should have put a footnote in the book, but it would have been the only one, and it would have been lonely. I took that phrase from the Roman Emperor Hadrian, who wrote one poem in his life on his deathbed, talking to his own departing soul, and he addresses it as Little Soul. And I thought that was so tender, and I couldn't come up with anything as good. So I bowed to him.
I love that. I love that in those poems. And this is from Ledger, right?
Yeah, thank you. So Amor Fati. Little soul, you have wandered lost a long time. The woods all dark now, birded and eyed. Then a light, a cabin of fire, a door standing open. The fairy tales warn you, do not go in. You who would eat will be eaten. You go in. You quicken. You want to have feet. You want to have eyes. You want to have fears.
I love this because it's that tremendous tension between taking risk, like stepping off a 100-foot pole, taking risk and not knowing, what is coming, but nevertheless, this urge to do that, and this kind of this knowledge that you must do this, despite what other people say, and there's that beautiful tension there.
Thank you. Thank you.
Besides being a wonderful Halloween poem, right? Do you have any other thoughts on Amor Fati?
Well, I do think it again, the vow and intention of permeability.
Mm.
This series of poems, the 8 poems were precipitated into being by the diagnosis, illness, and death of my first great love of glioblastoma, of brain cancer.
Mm.
And so some of them are more about him, and some of them are more contemplating all of our lives and deaths. And this one would be the more general, just, thinking about his death made me think about all of our deaths and my own. And so again, it is that willingness to enter, the willingness to have your house be permeable to the cold winds, to hunger, to moonlight, to embodiment, to this life. And I think I felt this is not usually how we describe the Bodhisattva vow, but it is part of the Bodhisattva vow, because the Bodhisattva is saying, no, I won't choose to remove myself from suffering. I will stay in this world of suffering until every last blade of grass is also able to be free of that. And so in a way, this is the Bodhisattva's poem. I seem to be getting sort of glary, so I'm going to do something to the light and see if that's better. I think that's better.
Yeah,
As the outside gets dark, the lighting in my room changes quite a lot. So sorry about that. We're meeting in a transitional liminal period. I'm a great believer in the liminal and the threshold. And Amor Fati is a poem of the threshold.
Yeah, absolutely.
The coming and going of us.
Yeah. Very powerful. Yeah. This was once a love poem.
Yes. So this was once a love poem is, I can't wait to hear what John has to say about it, because I was surprised that he picked it. So we're going to find out why he picked this poem. So it's a poem from the book Given Sugar, Given Salt, which is a little earlier than Come Thief. These are all my poems come out of the course of a life. And this poem wasn't actually thinking about me. It was thinking about a cousin who actually did have the cactus at the end. But of course, they're all thinking about me and my own life and the different stages of our relationship to Eros. This was once a love poem. This was once a love poem. Before its haunches thickened, its breath grew short, before it found itself sitting, perplexed and a little embarrassed on the fender of a parked car, while many people passed by without turning their heads. It remembers itself dressing as if for a great engagement. It remembers choosing these shoes, this scarf or tie. Once it drank beer for breakfast, drifted its feet in a river side by side with the feet of another. Once it pretended shyness, then grew truly shy, dropping its head so the hair would fall forward, so the eyes would not be seen. It spoke with passion of history, of art. It was lovely then, this poem. Under its chin, no fold of skin softened. Behind the knees, no pad of yellow fat. What it knew in the morning, it still believed at nightfall. An unconjured confidence lifted its eyebrows, its cheeks. The longing has not diminished. Still, it understands. It is time to consider a cat, the cultivation of African violets or flowering cactus. Yes, it decides many miniature cacti in blue and red painted pots. When it finds itself disquieted in the pure and unfamiliar silence of its new life, it will touch them, one, then another, with a single finger outstretched like a tiny flame. So tell me why I've just read that to you.
For me, as soon as I read this poem, I really thought that this was like a koan, where the poem is the koan. The koan's called poem.
Mm-hmm.
And I am the poem, and the poem is my life, and my haunches thickened, and I was slightly embarrassed, and I was a little bit shy. I acted shy, and then I was shy, and then, on, and I cultivate little cactuses in colored pots. And because for me, it was very koanic, if that's a word, it was very personal, right? And that's what the koan practice is that it's utmost personal, and
Yes.
intimate. And I could feel that in this poem. So that's why I loved it.
Well, what you are describing as the right way to enter a koan is also, of course, the right way to enter a poem.
Mm.
No matter what the pronoun of a poem is, for the reader, it is always written in the first person.
Mm. Mm.
We experience these things from the inside. We experience everything from the inside.
Yeah.
We understand everything with the material and context that our lives have given us. What else could we use?
Yeah. We have another koan, and we were talking before the program started about, we have a koan that's called Where Do Songs Come From? And it's sort of an Australian folktale almost. But the Chinese character for song is also the same character as poem.
Yes.
Ka, So where do poems come from? Where do poems come from? Yeah.
Well, poems come from a great mystery. I think it is one of the enduring, lovely mysteries of my life that I never know what's going to come. I never know when it will come. I never know what it will say. When I start writing, I don't know where I'm going. I don't know what the ending will be. I do know that it is, a little bit like searching with a metal detector, in that you do know if you have gone awry and you are not finding the ore of some genuine question, koan, dilemma, richness of your life, it's not a poem. It's a start, but it's not a poem yet. And so sometimes, very, very rarely, I have known in advance what it was I was trying to think about, but I'm never writing down what I already know. I am only inviting answers to unanswerable questions that still need to be met, that want to be addressed. For answerable questions, we have mathematics and engineering. For unanswerable questions, we have practice and we have art. And the unanswerable questions are the ones that never lose their interest. But, sometimes I know that, that something has happened in my life. It's hit me with a 2x4. I'm trying to respond to it. Sometimes a phrase will begin, a music will begin. Sometimes an image will come. And so, you know, sometimes I find the original first handwritten draft of a poem, and I'm stunned how little is there of what eventually came into the poem. But something comes that won't let me set it aside, doesn't want to be set aside. I understand, you know, an image in a poem that was recently in the New Yorker called Manifest, that has in it the image of a truck hauling folded tarps under a tarp. I don't know why that was so magnetizing for me. But I ended up, you know, so it began as sort of a list of things that were being hauled, which is, you know, that definition of the word manifest, a ship's cargo.
Yeah.
And then it ended up being one of the many poems I've been writing in recent years dealing with the crisis of the biosphere, which has become a very central subject for me. But I didn't know I was going to be writing about the crisis of the biosphere when I was first haunted by the line, you know, trucks hauling folded tarps under a tarp. But of course, you know, that's an image of, you know, is the covering the substance? I'm sure there's a koan in there.
Probably more than one.
Yes, probably several hundred.
Would you like to read Manifest?
Sure, I can do that. I need to pull it out of, since we hadn't talked about it beforehand.
Right.
Let me see. It should be here, but it'll take a moment. Sorry. Why don't you say something while I'm looking
okay.
for it?
I could read it if you want it. I've got it in front of me.
Well, that would be interesting. Sure.
Okay.
You read it. I'll drink.
Excuse my reading. Manifest. Hawks, rivers, cities, ochre, us. A species whose right hand sketches its left hand, but can't draw itself. Whales, geosynchronous satellites, a truck hauling folded tarps under a tarp. Wars, hunger, jail cells, praises, pratfalls, puns. Gold circuits on phone card connectors. All cargo, manifest, circling the sun together. Each 365 days, plus a few remnant hours. A story here ribboned with lightning, there dimmed by clouds, on a nitrogen, oxygen, carbon dioxide, and dust cushion bundle, whose glaciers depart, insects quiet, and seas rise. To that which is coming, I say, here, take what is yours, but forget if you can what is coming. Find not worth pocketing. Let fall unnoticed as weed seed, one small handful of moments and gestures. Moments mouse-colored, minor, gestures disturbing no one, slipped between the ones that were counted, the ones in which everything happened. A petroglyph's single fingerprint, a spider awake in an undusted corner. Let's stay, if you can, what is coming. One or two musical notes hummed in a half hour that couldn't be hearded or mined, made to save daylight or spend it. Leave one unfraudulent hope, one affection like curtains blown open in wind, whose minutes, seconds, fragrance, choices wouldn't sadden the heart to recall. In the asking new and selected poems to come out next year.
That was wonderfully read. Thank you.
Well, tell us more about Manifest.
Well, you know, so writing it, I began simply with this list of things. The tarps came early. The phone card connectors, I had to investigate and make sure I was calling them correctly. I had the physical object in mind before I knew quite what words would convey it. I like being a poet who includes the contemporary world in my work. So geosynchronous satellites and things like that, I think poetry has been for several millennia a development of how many more things can you bring into a poem and have it still feel like a poem. And so over the millennia, many things that would not have fit into poems in the past have come in. Amongst them, poems about parenthood. You never see a poem before the 20th century in which a man speaks about being a father. It just doesn't exist. Mothers speak about being mothers, but men don't speak about being fathers in poems. And then all of a sudden, in the middle of the last century, Galway Connell begins to, write the Book of Nightmares or the Book of Rags. Anyhow, one of his books, he has this beautiful description of his son Fergus being born. And it was the first time that any man, I think, had ever written of such a thing. So I have these geosynchronous satellites and the gold phone card connectors, but I didn't know where it was going to go. I liked my list. I liked the idea, but I didn't know how to end the poem for a long time. And I tried this and I tried that. And then finally, this idea of that what is coming, this possible future of erasure of this radiant, tender world that all of us gathered tonight were born into, and which we are seeing the transformation of and reading, every day in the newspaper, some story about the disappearing kelp forests off the California coast and the purple sea urchin invasion, or, fires, or wars, or the breakdown of the social compact between human beings. And, we don't know. Humility is the best antidote to despair, I think, because if you're going to despair about the future, it means you really think you're sure you know how bad it's going to get.
Right.
So for me, because I'm always trying to counter my own despair, and trying to be, an engaged activist person who does something every day to try to change the future that looks like it is coming. Just because it looks like it's coming doesn't mean you don't try. Put your one molecule onto the tiller of change, especially right now before the midterms. I'm sure everybody listening is in some way or other doing that. And so this
there's a line that we like. John Tarrant said, I don't know, a year or two ago when things were bad, said, "Despair assumes too much knowing."
Oh, wonderful! The same thought. I am lovely to share the thought with John, who I have known for so many decades now. But this poem puts its molecule onto the tiller of change by evoking tenderness, evoking that fingerprint in an ancient petroglyph and that living spider in the undusted corner, and then made its way to what for me was a thought I'd never had in a poem before. And I always, I want my poems not to repeat prior knowledge. I want them to find something I've never said before or felt in quite that shape or form before. And this idea of, just one thing that won't sadden the heart to recall, a pure tenderness that, you can go, the spider is still here. All is well. All is well. That marvelous saying of the mystic Julian of Norwich, all manner of things are well. All the mystics see the perfection of things as they are. no matter what the circumstances.
Mm.
And I think for not every poet, but most poets, that is one thing you are searching for in the darkness and the dismay of so many aspects of a human life. If you can also see the gleam of that moonlight coming in through the roof planks,
Right,
you will be happy. You know, the Turkish poet Hikmet, thrown in a jail cell for, I think, 12 years, wrote beautiful poems of life embrace and talked about, you know, the distant view of trees out his barred windows and how much he loved his wife. There is no circumstance in which a dust mote of the radiant cannot be recognized.
Yeah.
And there is no moment of beauty in which suffering cannot be remembered. It is holding both, you know, both in our hands in a way that allows us to continue our practice, our sense of connection with one another, our playful embrace of words that make nice sounds. All of that, I think, is part of what poetry is about. It's not about recording something. It is about throwing open the gates of the possible in ways that are hard to remember sometimes. And when they're hard to remember, you go find a poem or a koan, or your zafu, and they help you remember.
Nice. We have others we can read if you'd like. One I had a question about was the envoy.
That's a good one.
Could you read that one and tell us about that?
Yes,
Another not knowing koan, you know, very much I felt.
A not knowing poem, and also, although nothing in the poem says so, you're a good dowser because it's another Tassajara poem. The cabin being described. I've gone back for many years and taught a poetry workshop at Tassajara in the summer, and this happened in my Tassajara cabin one of those summers. And whenever I would read it at my readings that week, I would assure the guests that this was a student cabin, not a guest cabin. So, the envoy. One day in that room, a small rat. 2 days later, a snake, who, seeing me enter, whipped the long stripe of his body under the bed, then curled like a docile house pet. I don't know how either came or left. Later, the flashlight found nothing. For a year, I watched as something, terror, happiness, grief, entered and then left my body, not knowing how it came in, not knowing how it went out. It hung where words could not reach it. It slept where light could not go. Its scent was neither snake nor rat, neither sensualist nor ascetic. There are openings in our lives of which we know nothing. Through them, the belled herds travel at will, long-legged and thirsty, covered with foreign dust.
I love this image of the dust of the world. We have some koans. My mass teacher, the dust of the world is covering me, or in the 10 Oxfordine pictures, you know, he walks by Hoti, he comes back into the market with the dust of the world on him. Yeah. So tell us about the poem a little bit, if you might.
Well, in this case, as not infrequently, it actually happened. You know, I don't get Jungian credit for the snake. Perhaps I get Jungian credit for remembering, you know, or for being attracted to the snake, and putting it in the poem. But, you know, I was there I think I wrote it, you know, the next day while I was still at Tassajara. And so this interesting thing happened of, first you see a little rodent and then you see a snake, and the snake is going to eat the rat if it can. That's what it's there to do. And so I just watched them, the snake, seeing me come in, goes and hides. I like hidden things. I think that's interesting. Later I looked, I couldn't find it. And then there's the turn. Poems often have a turn in them,
Yes.
where the second subject comes in. If there's no second subject, there's no poem. So for a year, I watched as something, terror, happiness, grief, entered and then left my body. And that is where the personal life meets the event that called the poem into being. And I won't give you the facts behind it. I will just say it's true. And that, for a year I had been in this condition and just holding, observing, watching. Words couldn't get there, light couldn't get there, didn't smell like a snake or a rat. And what the poem finds as a conclusion is saying yes to what comes. There are openings in our lives of which we know nothing. I didn't have to understand what had been happening in my life. I merely had to live it, to agree to it. And then, the final stanza of the poem, through them the belled herds travel at will, long-legged and thirsty, covered with foreign dust. Now that's a non-Tassajara image. That one goes back to something I had remembered from a month when I was working at the Rockefeller Foundation's retreat for scholars and artists in Bellagio on Lake Como in Italy. And you would hear across the lake the belled herds. You would hear these at night. And that is beauty, that is mystery, that is the other lives that support our life. None of us is alone in this world. None of us is solitary or cut off. And from time to time, no matter how much you are baffled and bewildered and leading your own life and not knowing what to do with it, you will hear the belled herds, and they will bring with them their thirst, their dust, and you will be accompanied. And that, I think, is also the work of poems. A poem will come to you when you feel alone in whatever your experience is. You'll read some poem and you'll realize somebody else has felt this before me. Not only have they felt it, they've lived. Not only have they felt it and lived, they've borne witness. And so I too can survive this. Whatever it is, if Hikmet survived it, I can survive it.
I heard you give a talk, or you were in a talk one time, and you have a poem about that, about when you're at the Bellagio way up on the mountainside there, and you couldn't write, and then you had to put yourself in the locals' bodies almost to begin to write, and then it came forth, and it was beautiful, I thought, embodiment. But what I'd like to do, if it's okay, Jane, is I'd like to open it up to John Tarrant and Allison Atwell and see if they have any thoughts. We have lots of poems left, but let's just switch over to them
and
first.
While they're talking, I don't want to baffle you all, but there's a cat throwing himself at the door right next to me, and I'm going to open the door, but I can hear everything. So I'm just going to let the cat in.
The cat.
Yes, that was Martin. And any of you who get the New York Review of Books, Martin has a poem in the current New York Review of Books.
We'll look for it. There's those moments when everything gets interrupted for a cat are always very important, I think.
Well, also it's a marvelous rhyme from, you just read us this poem about the cat coming into your cabin.
And well, the rat
happening again.
But yes, creatures want in, and we let them in.
I have a more, like, I'd like to hear you read some of the poems of your choice that you would like us to know about. And then I do have a question about the creative process.
Gosh, my whole list had been John's list, so I wasn't really thinking about what of my own I would want to add. I'll read from John's list because I liked his list. I thought he had a good and interesting array. I'll read the title poem from Come Thief. And the story behind it is one that I figure some of you all might have made this connection. The poem isn't very clear about it, but there's the old Chinese teaching story about the hermit monk who comes back to his cabin and he's been robbed and the only thing left is a very heavy cast iron pan, and he picks it up and goes running down the road after the thief and says, come back, you forgot this. Except in the case of this poem, the thief is time and the transition and transitoriness of our own lives. Come, thief. The Mandarin silence of windows before their view, like guards who nod to every visitor, pass. Come, thief. The path to the doorway agrees. A fire requires its own conflagration, as birth does, as love does, saying to time to the end, dear one, enter. So again, that's very continuous with the themes we've talked about. I will read you one poem, which is from Ledger, which is the most recent book. It came out at the start of the pandemic. The poem was written in 2014 with the crisis of the biosphere in mind. And I tend to say crisis of the biosphere rather than climate change because I want to include all the crises of exploitation, the crises of extinction, the crises of toxin in the waters, and climate change. So this poem was written thinking about that, and it happened to get published by choice, because they thought it suited, on the day of the 2017 inauguration. And so it went viral as a political poem as well. Let them not say. Let them not say, we did not see it. We saw. Let them not say, we did not hear it. We heard. Let them not say they did not taste it. We ate. We trembled. Let them not say it was not spoken, not written. We spoke. We witnessed with voices and hands. Let them not say they did nothing. We did not enough. Let them say, as they must say, something. A kerosene beauty. It burned. Let them say we warmed ourselves by it, read by its light, praised, and it burned. Now there's a name for this kind of poem, which I only learned after writing it, apotropaic, which means a spell to preclude something happening. And this poem imagined the future looking back on us and our current decisions. And it is written in the hope that by foreseeing the worst, by foreseeing we did not enough, that we will do enough. And that, my great hope is that in 100 years, people will look at that and say, what was she so worried about? What a silly poem. What an unnecessary poem. That never happened. That's what the poem is trying to invite, that we foresee the judgment of the future on our choices and our time. And we do not allow a future of all of it burning to, in fact, arrive. So that's a note we hadn't covered in this conversation. So I bring in that more explicitly engaged poem. John?
There are sutras or spells to peg ones to turn away demons, or by naming them and describing them intimately and voluptuously, even. Yeah. The movement I've seen in a few of your poems, I guess I just wanted to ask about, because it seems like a movement in consciousness that not that many poets notice, and as opposed to other things like lost love or whatever, which are multitudinous. It's in Envoy, and it's in, there's a poem of yours, just I'm picking up almost at random, but called Many Roofed Building in Moonlight, which has it too, where you're having an experience, and it's a little bit, you were talking about how you wake up at night and there's this, something's happening in the psyche and the mind, and you're not really sure you even want to characterize it, but it's sort of hard, and it's work, and it's a journey, and that sort of thing. And one of the things you do is you don't break it down or make resolutions or things like that, which is a good thing. and somehow the sort of just having it there seems, it's like I suppose Dzogchen is what the Tibetans would call it, but by just having it there, it organizes itself eventually. And then there's that funny side kick you do, dance step you do, that's, I named the many roofed thing because it does that. It's a very good example of that kind of thing.
Do you have it handy? Would you like to read it to people?
Well, anyway, would you? I felt embarrassed.
You can, because you've got it, and it would take me a minute to dig it out.
Yeah, I don't mind you digging it out. I'd love to hear you.
Okay, remind me which book it's in.
It's in The Beauty.
Beauty, all right.
And on the hardback edition, it's on page 49.
Page 4. Look how beautiful the cover of The Beauty is. Isn't
The
that
cover of The Beauty
cover?
is itself a beauty, yes.
Okay, 49, eh? Many roofed building in moonlight. I found myself suddenly voluminous, three-dimensioned, a many-roofed building in moonlight. Thought traversed me as simply as moths might. Feelings traversed me as fish. I heard myself thinking, it isn't the piano, it isn't the ears. Then heard too soon the ordinary furnace, the usual footsteps above me. Washed my face again with hot water, as I did when I was a child. So I'm so happy you chose that poem, because of course what it's describing at the beginning is a kind of samadhi-like condition of awakening when we are permeable, continuous. There's that moonlight that in Japanese literature often alludes to awakening. And whatever it was that thoughts traversed me as simply as moths might, feelings traversed me as fish. So what might have been otherwise difficult is not difficult when you are a many-roofed building in moonlight, because the self. So in poetry, one thing I discovered when I did the anthology Women in Praise of the Sacred, which includes poems by women mystics from every tradition for 43 centuries of history. And one thing I became very conscious of looking at those poems is how often in a poem, any reference to a building or a house is a description, it's a portrait of the condition of the self. If you talk about your house, you're talking about your life, your existence, your sense of your existence. And so this was a very large building with lots of roofs, voluminous, fully dimensional. and things come in, things go out. All these poems are tying together so wonderfully. This whole conversation is seems to have found itself on a thread, with each bead clicking against the next. And it isn't the piano, it isn't the ears. There was no self to parse this experience, only the opening. And then, as happens, the world comes back. The big building's furnace kicked in, and I heard the furnace, and then the person above me in the building started walking around over my head. And it was still in the middle of the night. And what isn't said, and maybe people will hear it or not, is, why do you wash your face? You wash your face because you've been crying. The tears of openness, the tears of opening. In Latin, lacrimae rerum, the tears of existence. In Japanese, you have mono no aware, the great sadness of things, which is also the great beauty of things. And we weep in those conditions. And so then I washed my face, and because I was away from home, and because it was like when I was a child and you're comforting yourself, I allowed myself hot water that time.
Well, thanks. I'm very interested in the way, and I thought in some way, and this might be wrong, but in some way, when you're dealing with really difficult material, in a way the same things happens. It drifts through and it drifts by, and you live with it until something shifts, until it assembles something, and you don't do a lot of like heavy steer wrestling to make it assemble. Right. You track it more, like you're more of a tracker through the woods than somebody herding the ox, so something.
Well, for me, one of the great lessons of those 3 years at Tassajara and the sessions, one thing that taught me, and why I wanted to be there, was because even though I didn't know what I needed to learn, I knew I needed to learn something, was that on the Zafu, anything can come up and you're not going to act on it. You're not going to harm your own life or anybody else's life, no matter what presents itself to you. You just stay on the Zafu. And if you stay on the Zafu long enough and you pay attention, it changes. And your relationship to it changes. And I think that has to do with what it is what you just described. I was thinking as you were talking, I was saying, well, yes, that's how a practiced person responds to the difficult.
The conclusions were never necessary, that the universe the Tao makes the conclusions.
Yeah. And if you just say yes to it and don't add to harm, things will resolve. We won't go to war with one another if we sit on our Zafus and study the difficult and weigh the difficult. And I'm not saying that you don't ever try to change the world. Of course, we try to change the world. But at least we try to change it in ways that aren't driven by the brutal winds of an injured ego. There's a difference. What is the motivation? So a question I worked with for a long time during my years at Zen Center, we were encouraged. So we did not do formal koan training in those years. The stories were told, they were alluded to, but nobody was studying koans in a practice way. But we were told to find a question. And for many, many years, my question was, what is the emotional life of a Buddha? Because the classic teachings have quite a number of different answers to this. They aren't the same answer. The Pali texts talk about, that part of your life will just burn up and, vanish like ash in the wind. The passions are not to be embraced or lived through. They are to be extinguished, is, what some of the Pali texts at least say. And then, of course, the Tibetan Vajrayana tradition talks about enlisting all of these energies and transforming them, but not, they're not supposed to wither away. And in Zen, there are a number of stories. I wrote a piece for Tricycle magazine about it, which is, somewhere buried deep in their archives. What I liked about Zen is one story, for instance, you can tell these koans much better than I can, but the one where, an old woman has been supporting a monk for a long time, and then she sends her beautiful young granddaughter with his meal and instructs the granddaughter to embrace the monk and let her know what is his response to this full embrace of her young and beautiful body against his. And the monk answers something like, withered tree in winter, no change. And the granddaughter goes back, reports this to the older woman, and she says, I have been supporting the fraud for all these years. And she goes and she burns down his hut and throws him out. So, I love that story. And I also love some of the commentary on the story. And I believe this is Dogen's comment, but I could have it wrong, and you please correct me if I do, everybody's practice is great. The old woman's practice is great. The granddaughter's practice is great. I just love that story. And for me, this question, what is the emotional life of the Buddha, as a young American woman entering the life of practice, especially a young American woman, shaped by the 60s and 70s, this was a real koan for me. Is what is a relationship to the emotions? And after years of living inside it and pondering it, I finally came to feel that, my answer, and I've always said, I might be a heretic who should be thrown out, burn down my hut if you don't like my answer, it's fine. I like backpacking. But it's that we practice with the full range of human emotions, because that is the piano of knowledge we have been given. Every note on the piano is information about our response to the world. But for a fully awakened Buddha, I would guess, because I've never been one, but my guess is they would still have all those emotions, but never in the service of small self, only in the service of all beings. That's my.
As far as we know, Ma Zu was the sort of originator of that line of inquiry. So you're a follower of Ma Zu in that way, or at least people would say, what is Buddha? And he said, this very heart mind, your thoughts and feelings are Buddha.
Yes. And the wonderful, is it Hakuin? This very body is the body of the Buddha.
Yeah, that's his song, Suzanne.
Yeah.
I rudely, John said to either Alison or me talk, and I rudely jumped into in my eagerness to talk to you, and we have very little time left. I don't know if Alison had anything she wanted to say, but I feel
no, I think you.
Embarrassment in that regard.
I was thrilled just to hear the conversation there. You asked questions that I'm glad you did, and I got to hear the answers to. I just wanted to thank you so much, Jane, for giving us this lovely, incredible evening, and really appreciate that you came to see us this evening.
Well, thank you. I appreciate anybody who wanted to spend their evening with us talking about these things. It is a great pleasure for me to be with fellow practitioners and be able to speak directly of what usually I don't talk about that directly. It makes me feel as if when my poems can circle back into a context of Sangha, I feel the non-separateness of parts of my life that, I used to look like a monk. I wore robes. I followed the schedule. Now I look like a poet. My Raksu has been on twice in 48 hours, but that's because I was at a memorial service for Yvonne Rand over the weekend. But I can go a long time between putting my Raksu on. But I like to think that I'm walking around inside of the Raksu, whether I'm wearing it or not. You know, there's a marvelous, what was printed. I don't know how many people listening would know who Yvonne was, senior early Zen Center student of Suzuki Roshi's, who was always a central figure within San Francisco Zen Center, and then founded her own practice group, helped bring Jizo to more awareness in America, helped bring hospice practice to America. And she had fairly pronounced Alzheimer's at the end of her life for quite a while. And still 2 days before she died, she said, I don't know what occasioned this, but from the great silence and the great unknowing of her later years, her Dharma perception never seems to have left her. And what was printed on the front of the memorial program was, no forms. We just say thank you.
That's
Pretty
wonderful.
good.
That's pretty good, yeah. And Jane, thank you. It's just wonderful to hear you, like, be bathed in the light that you bring in the poems. So thank you, the golden
Thank
light
you
of the
so
poems.
much.
So, yeah.
It has been a great pleasure.
Thank you, Jane. Yeah, yeah. Would you like to hear some four vows, Jane, on the way out?
Absolutely.
Okay. Is Jordan, are you free?
I vowed to wake all the beings of the world. I vowed to set and this heartache to rest. I vowed to walk through every wisdom gate. I vowed to live the great Buddha way. I vow to wake all the beings of the world. I vow to set and this heartache to rest. I vow to walk through every wisdom gate. I vow to live the great Buddha way. I vow to wake all the beings of the world. I vow to set and this heartache to rest. I vow to walk through every wisdom gate. And I vow to live the great Buddha way.
Well, thank you, Jordan. That's so lovely. And thank you so much, Allison and John, for coming in and giving us your insights. And thank you, Jane, for joining us. It's just been such a pleasure getting to know you over the last weeks. So